When we think of the uniforms of the American Revolution, usually we think of red, sometimes referred to as scarlet, being associated with the British Empire, and blue with the burgeoning United States and its Continental Army. Though this wasn't as cut and dry as many people think, this general association is the most prevalent. That being said, there were quite a few examples of Continental Forces, be they state regiments, irregulars, or militia units wearing red uniforms throughout the war. Though it was a more common thing in the prior decades, be it through garrison British units, colonial provincial troops, or even militia forces, we'll be talking about 8 specific units which stood out, quite literally, for continuing to use or even adopting red uniforms to varying capacities throughout the war. Now, before we start, it's important to define 2 elements of the coat, as it will be mentioned a few times throughout. The primary color of the coat is just that. However, the element referred to as the facing or facings is what often helped denote a regiment or unit. The facing was simply areas of the coat where the lining was exposed or where the areas were folded out and over, so things like tails, cuffs, and most noticeably, the lapels. Up first is the 1st Maryland Regiment, also known as Smallwood's Regiment after its commander, Colonel William Smallwood. Now, we're including this unit, but do take note the jury is still out regarding to what extent red uniforms were worn during the conflict. This unit was formed in 1776, but sort of saw its origins in 1774 with one of its original companies, known as the Baltimore Independent Cadets. Members of this company, along with some members of other units from the city, were originally equipped with red uniforms. When the war broke out, the unit mustered up another 6 companies from Baltimore and Annapolis. Being that not every member could be immediately equipped with proper uniforms, hunting frocks of various colors began being seen by many, as it was easy to source and provided a level of uniformity. As for the red uniform, there is still a bit of conjecture whether it was actually seen being used when fighting against the British, but some historians believe that the occasional officer may have worn, or at least had on hand, the red uniforms throughout the first year of the Revolution. Next up is another early unit which technically originally formed on April 27, 1775, the 1st Connecticut Regiment. Now, this one is mentioned often as a prevalent unit to wear red, however many Connecticut soldiers, be they army or militia, were initially equipped with red early in the war before changing to other colors, brown being one of the most popular. Back to the 1st though. It was one of the earliest units to fight in the war, taking part in the Siege of Boston as well as the invasion of Canada, but was disbanded around early 1776. However, the name was again picked up with its authorization later that year and would see fighting through January 1st of 1781, when it merged with the 8th Connecticut Regiment, which also for a short time in 1779 was equipped with red uniforms under the name of the 5th Connecticut Regiment. What makes them stand out was their adoption and rather long usage of red uniforms seen between 1776 and 1779. These were likely captured uniforms, with many members seen wearing ones with either dark blue or white facings. What's a little funny about all this is that Connecticut became a state that was famous for providing provisions, that being supplies, equipment, uniforms, and so on, to much of the Continental Army throughout the war, gaining it the nickname of the Provision State. Established out of Pennsylvania on January 5, 1777, was the 4th Continental Light Dragoons, one of the few cavalry units seen early in the war. Also known as Moylan's Horse after its commander Colonel Stephen Moylan, members were initially outfitted with red jackets featuring blue facings, obtained from surrendering British forces at Saratoga. It's been said this color was chosen to confuse the enemy, which proved successful at least once when a group of loyalists mistook them for British cavalry. However, it had the same effect on American forces, leading to them being fired upon by friendlies and gaining flack for it from others. Perhaps one of the earliest and most well-known examples came from Commander George Washington, who sent a letter to Moylan in May relating to the issue. "Dear Sir, a party of your regiment has arrived here yesterday with an escort of money. Their appearance has convinced me fully of the danger which I always apprehended from the similarity of their uniform to that of the British horse. And the officer who commands the party tells me that the people were exceedingly alarmed upon the road, and had they been traveling through a part of the country where it might have been supposed the enemy's horse would be foraging or scouting, they would in all probability have been fired upon. The inconvenience will increase when your regiment joins the army. Your patrols will be in constant danger from our own scouting parties, and whenever there is occasion to dispatch a party into the country, they will alarm the inhabitants. I therefore desire that you will immediately fall upon means for having the color of the coats changed, which may be done by dipping into that kind of dye that is most proper to put upon red. "I care not what that is, so that the present color may be changed." Now, Washington was quite outspoken in relation to using captured British as well as red uniforms, and did bring it up on a few occasions, both in relation to security of forces as well as the possibility of using them to trick the British. We'll talk about this viewpoint throughout the rest of the video. But back to the 4th. Instead of dyeing them another color, linen hunting shirts were worn over them until they began wearing a green coat with red facing sometime between the second half of 1778 and early 1779. Up until this point, the units we've talked about were either already established or ones that were part of a state's quota for regiments as declared by the Continental Congress. These regiments would fall under a state line, which was primarily composed of units referred to by a number followed by the state name. For example, the 1st New Jersey Regiment, which, along with the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and so on, would make up the New Jersey line. However, as 1776 gave way to 1777, the scope of the Revolution and the fighting that came with it expanded. But at the same time, enlistments of many soldiers ended. This required both a restructuring of the army, but also the need to keep existing troops as well as recruit new ones. Seeing the total number of regiments from each state, General George Washington requested Congress to raise 16 additional ones separate from the aforementioned state lines. Only 14 ended up being established. These 14 would be referred to as additional regiments, and since they didn't directly relate to any of the states, they were often referred to by the founder or appointed commanders of said unit, and would fall under the direct authority of Washington. Of the 14 established, 2 were recorded wearing red uniforms. The first is that of the aptly named Henley's Additional Continental Regiment, which was active between 1777 and 1779. Made up of forces from New Hampshire and Massachusetts, it chose a uniform composed of a red coat with sky blue facings, along with light infantry caps as opposed to tricorn ones, which gave the unit an overall more formal and proper appearance. Come 1779, it was merged into the 16th Massachusetts Regiment, seeing an end to the usage of the red uniforms, at least in a major capacity, as it adopted the colors of the 16th as well as prescribed to the General Order of October 2nd, 1779, which essentially made blue the official color of the Continental Army. The 2nd regiment form that saw red uniforms was that of Webb's Additional Continental Regiment, named after its commander, Colonel Samuel Webb. The name was eventually changed to the 9th Connecticut Regiment after being added to the Connecticut line in 1780. Seen as one of the most properly equipped and trained units of the war, they utilized uniforms captured at sea en route to British units in Canada. These sported red coats with yellow facings. They would continue to wear these uniforms until 1781, when they merged with the 2nd Connecticut Regiment. As with the 4th Light Dragoons, George Washington went on record protesting the wearing of captured British and red-colored uniforms, though many knew that the usage of it was necessary in some cases, as provisions and uniforms were often in short supply. However, some also suggested using them for tactical reasons, as in 1778, Washington had even suggested using Webb's regiment for a special operation to capture General Henry Clinton, who served as British Commander-in-Chief of North America from his post in New York City. Though the operation never happened, Washington, now evidently lightening up to the whole concept of red uniforms, wrote, "If the scheme is practicable at all, may add not a little to the success, namely to let the officers and soldiers employed in the enterprise be dressed in red, and much in the taste of the British soldiery. Webb's regiment will afford these dresses, and it might not be amiss to know certainly the number of some regiment that is quartered in the city. Under some circumstances, this knowledge may avail them." We'll circle back to Washington and the idea of using red uniforms generally towards the end of the video. Now, for the most part, we've talked about entire units. However, there were more specific and small-scale examples of Continental Forces wearing red. Oftentimes, more properly equipped regiments would reverse its colors for musicians, specifically their drummers. This was done as it was important to keep a proper eye on them so as to ensure troops remained in formation and knew what was transpiring on the battlefield. Though this wasn't always the case, it was seen as an important thing to do and was taken into account with the 1779 uniform regulations, which urged units to do so. Many units did their best to adhere to these requirements, but a shortage of money and supplies often meant regiments could only make do with what they had. However, there were examples of regiments equipped with red facings reversing their colors, meaning their drummers would be seen with a distinctly red uniform. 2 instances of this came in the form of elements of the Continental Artillery as well as the 1st Maryland Regiment. The Continental Artillery is an interesting one, as it saw quite a bit of restructuring throughout the war, but quickly became one of the most professional and well-dressed units of the Continental Army. When the new regulations came out, not much had to be changed with them. However, there were examples of drummers having to switch their colors, as seen here. Once again, that brings us to the 1st Maryland Regiment. Having eventually switched their uniform colors to blue with red facing, it inevitably led to their drummers having to wear the reverse. So whereas before the whole unit was in red, now only the drummers were. Now it's important to note these were just 2 examples, and there were likely quite a bit more, as things like regulations and the need to dress musicians distinctly likely played a large part in many regiments throughout the conflict. Finally, we have perhaps one of the most peculiar units to wear red, though the concerns, as seen with most of the other ones referenced here, likely weren't as relevant. This unit was the Corps of Invalids, originally resolved to be raised by Congress on June 20th, 1777. This unit was to be composed of sick, injured, or just unfit veterans who could be of use in less direct and physical tasks, such as garrison duties, guarding areas of importance, as well as dealing with prisoners. Now, the Corps of Invalids was a concept employed by the British Army since 1688, and so this idea likely spawned from that, as its commander and creator Louis Nicola was a British Army veteran of the French and Indian War. Regardless, many troops were noted as utilizing a variety of uniforms, ranging from the ones worn by them when serving with former regiments to green coats and even captured British uniforms dyed brown. However, the most interesting piece of clothing they were reported to have worn were large red overcoats, giving them a very unique look that differed greatly from many other forces of the Continental Army. Being that this uniform looked vastly different from British ones, not to mention their frequent distance from the battlefield, the issue of confusing them with enemy units was not really a concern. And those were 8 notable Continental units who were seen wearing red, though it is worth mentioning that a number of other forces were likely to have used them as well, be it on an individual or even unit level. So this all begs the question, why? Apart from red obviously being a stark color, most of the forces the Continental Army was fighting were outfitted in it. Surely it would be a dangerous problem for them any way you cut it. It certainly was, but the pros, or better yet the needs of forces, outweighed the cons. Over the course of the war, close to 15,000 British uniforms were captured, many of which were then repurposed for American forces. Being that the Continental Congress and various state powers were having a hard time properly equipping men with all sorts of things, spare uniforms were taken and used anytime they were available. This included British ones. Many were modified, dyeing them to a more brown color. Sometimes more unique shades were also seen, such as purple. However, a majority of these captured pieces were simply worn unaltered, either due to forces choosing not to or not having the means to do so. As stated earlier, this practice frustrated certain higher-ups such as George Washington. It became so noticeable that he even wrote a letter to Clothier General James Mees, insisting that soldiers stop wearing red-color uniforms for safety and security reasons. Being more and more convinced of the impolicy of any part of our troops being clothed in red, and that many injurious and fatal consequences are to be apprehended from it, I think it necessary to repeat my request mentioned in my last, that you will have all the clothes in your hands of that color dyed of some other, as soon as you can. Unless the matter is immediately remedied by changing the color, our people will be destroying themselves. Now, red was usually worn when forces couldn't wear anything else or alter its color. However, again, as mentioned earlier, other reasons were considered, such as sowing confusion among enemy ranks, as was the case with the 4th Light Dragoons and even Webb's additional regiment, who even captured a British spy relaying a message to forces in Canada after he mistook them for British guards. Though this thought process did bear benefits, it also was something of a double-edged sword, as Continental forces and locals could mistake Americans wearing red as British, leading to friendly fire incidents. Ultimately, at the end of the day, though, it came down to the Continental Congress and Army having to make do with what they had on hand. Finally, before we end this video, it is worth noting that many of the same colors were seen on both sides of the war, with the only difference being slightly varying hues. For example, green was often seen worn by loyalists and German mercenaries on the British side, but also by various infantry and cavalry regiments on the American, though one could argue these colors weren't as widespread. A very special thanks to O'Reilly's Art, who illustrated the 8 uniforms highlighted throughout the video. You can find him on Instagram, link to which can be found in the description below. This will conclude our first dive into uniforms of the American Revolution. If you enjoyed it, perhaps leave a like and subscribe if you haven't already done so. If not, no worries, just be sure to check back soon for more videos right here on Uniform History.